Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to explore some of the lessons learned from the U.S. government's 20-year experimental adventure in psychic espionage, Project Stargate. With me is Dr. Ed May, who was the research director of that program for 10 years, from 1985 until it closed in about 1996. And he was with the program for 10 years before that. Dr. May is an experimental physicist, and he is co-author of ESP Wars, East and West. He is also co-author of Anomalous Cognition, Remote Viewing, Research and Theory. And he is the co-editor of a 2-volume anthology of research papers titled Extrasensory Perception, Support, Skepticism, and Science. In addition, he is the recipient of a Lifetime Career Award from the Parapsychological Association. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Pleasure to be here.
And it's a pleasure to be with you. You know, this is now our 10th interview.
Really?
Yeah. It's been a great pleasure doing all of them with you. I hope that people who view this one will take the opportunity to look at some of the others.
Good.
And I believe that this may be the most important of the 10, which is why we saved it for last,
okay.
I think.
Well, I'll tell you, overall, what have we learned in 150 years of doing psi research? I think we should never, except for teaching reasons, ever do another random number generator experiment. We should never, ever do another remote viewing experiment, except for teaching purposes. And we should never, ever do, in some sense, psychophysiology experiments, because, for proof-oriented, because the data are in, and they are, at least in my view and many others, incontrovertible, meaning that is not the same thing as saying that ESP exists. It just says we have an anomaly in this data. We don't need any more data to prove that it's an anomaly. Even Ray Hyman, one of the chief skeptics of our field, agrees with that statement. Okay, given that we're not going to do that, except for teaching purposes, what's left to do? One whale of a lot. Yeah. And it's not clear to me the current generation of parapsychologists, or maybe even future ones, are in fact in a position to be able to do what's next. We need to know neurophysiology. We need to know brain science. We need to have some challenging physics, which we've talked about. And most people who are involved in research parapsychology, including myself, are not equipped to do that. The amount of instrumentation that we need to do the next step in neuroscience, nobody in parapsychology can afford it or has access to that stuff. So one of the things that I think that most parapsychologists, even the young ones coming up, need to do is to be able to school their students into how they can enter the mainstream and still bring some of their parapsychological belief structure with them.
Now, you were successful in doing that, probably more than anybody else in the history of the field, of getting mainstream support for your research. But most parapsychologists are not able to do that.
Yeah, that's a complex thing. I have written a paper on the idea, and it's very complex. Part of it is we as scientists are terrible at discussing the joy and the value of our data. And we argue about it, which good science do, but when we present it to the public, you know, well, I'm not sure it's really there, but. No, that's not going to convince anybody. Yeah. And so what do you say? We have a fantastic phenomenon. If you don't think it is, demonstrate to me in an experiment that it's not real. And when mainstream people venture into that area, they say, wow, this is pretty interesting. Now, I've been talking to mainstream people probably for 25 years. And with some exceptions, they say, no, wait a minute, this is something weird. I'll tell you one story about a fellow. He's now deceased. He was a Nobel laureate. He invented the bubble chamber in physics. His name was Don Glaser.
Mm-hmm.
And
I met him.
You did?
Yeah.
Well, we were in holiday together in the Galapagos.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first met him, he asked what I did. And I never tell people what I actually did because it was classified most of the time. And I said, well, I'm a quantum physicist. I didn't know who he was at the time. He says, well, funny thing you should say that. And my wife was going, whack, whack, whack. And so as we're being tourists around the Galapagos Islands, one night I said to him, maybe I should tell you what I really did. And he got really interested. And the next few days, we're walking along and out in the middle of the Galapagos, he taps me on the shoulder and says, hey, have you thought of course we thought of it. It's kind of like taking a Nobel chemist and saying, did you remember to wash your test tubes? That's kind of the clever.
Well, but it is because so many scientists assume that researchers in parapsychology must be idiots or fools.
Right. Well, what's fascinating is one of the leading critics of our field, Ray Hyman. I went to the 20th Congress of Psychops, into the lion's den of skeptics.
Yes.
And I watched Hyman from the stage say, do not underestimate parapsychologists. They are, and this is an exact quote, some of the best methodologists I know, end of story. And I went up to him afterwards and said, that was pretty brave of you in this. Congratulations. And you're right. And one of the reasons parapsychologists are so good at their methodology is everybody's clobbering them.
Yeah.
They have to be holier than thou to do their work. Mm-hmm. But we have reached an impasse in our field because with all good intentions, you need more than that to take the next step. We're victims of our own success because we don't have to prove anything anymore. We now have to try to understand what's going on. And to take that next step requires a lot more training than I have for sure, and it requires a lot more access to instrumentation, which is not easy to come to in our field.
Well, the conventional wisdom for people entering the field, the wisdom I never followed, but you certainly did, is to get your credentials in some more conventional field, get established in a conventional field, and then you can begin to branch out in parapsychology once you're secure professionally.
Right. Well, there's some sociological pressure, which is not our fault. I have a dear friend who's got her degree in neuroscience and is a very competent neuroscience scientist. But she started allowing people to realize her interest in this area and went on some questionable websites with some Indian guru types. She can't get a job. Cannot get a job because she's been associated with the wacko types. And that's not fair to the wacko types because they're really not wacko, but the mainstream science thinks they are. And, I have great sorrow for this person. Unfortunately, we've got to be in the closet a bit further. And as we begin to make inroads, and I'm not the only one, making inroads into the mainstream people getting interested in this, that will become easier and easier and easier to collect people. Because one of the problems we have overall, you can't make a living as a 100% parapsychologist. And so if you're a competent young neuroscientist and you have an interest in this, I would advise them, do not come into parapsychology. Get your, as you said earlier, get your real degree in neuroscience. And I did it in physics, not because I hoped that's how I'd get into parapsychology. I'd never heard of parapsychology. Until way late.
As somebody who didn't follow that advice, and honestly, I don't regret my own path, I noticed that other people who come to parapsychology out of mainstream psychology or physics have less of an appreciation, I think, for the history of the field
very definitely.
As a whole.
That includes me. I know very little about the history of the field. And that's a challenge for people. Look, at the end of the day, doing parapsychology experiments is not rocket science. It's easy compared to trying to understand the genetic history of a rabbit. It's much harder. Or neuroscience. People like to say, well, it's not rocket science. Actually, rocket science is pretty easy. What is not hard, what is not easy is neuroscience. It's a wrong metaphor.
Rocket science is not rocket science.
Yes, right. There you go.
But let's talk about applications. That's the Stargate program was primarily an applications
99%
program. And it seems to me, as you've pointed out, we no longer need to prove the reality of the phenomenon. We need to understand it better. But I think that we're in a position where we can also develop new applications, wouldn't you say?
That's a tricky case. One of the problems with people interested in application of parapsychology, they think, oh, I've got a miracle. Can I think of an application for a miracle? I'll think I'll levitate a monk to the moon. We tend to, as a discipline of parapsychologists, overestimate the quality that can come by psychic information.
All right.
We really do. One exception to that is what's called associational remote viewing. You can take some pretty crummy remote viewing and turn it into an application where it really produces actually winning money. And there are groups of people who believe that we can influence the mainstream people by coming away with hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever it's going to take, winning by sports betting using psychic ability.
Or the stock market.
Or the stock market, whatever. And I hope that's successful. It's a very difficult way to go. John Mcdonnell works for the police departments often. And I think Marcello Truzzi wrote a book, I've forgotten the name of it.
The Blue Sense.
The Blue Sense. And, police departments are happy to use psychics. Either they're murderers or psychic. Can't tell.
Now, if they find a missing body, for example, it has happened that psychics on occasion have been accused of being the criminal.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
It's happened.
Oh, poor people. I feel sorry.
They've had to say, no, I'm really a psychic.
Yeah, right. A murderer psychic. That's, But the serious part, how to move forward. First of all, why? Why don't we quit? This is tiny phenomena. It's weak phenomena. It's on the edges of understanding things, but that's not really correct. Our technology will get at a deeper understanding about space and time through precognition. Is it going to change everything we know about physics? No. No new advance in physics has changed everything. Some of it has been really philosophical big, like quantum theory versus quantum mechanics, but it doesn't change your pool game. It doesn't change how you play football. The lived experience of quantum mechanics doesn't exist.
Well, it sounds to me as if you had to say, one thing that really excites you about the future of the field, it's the interface with neurophysiology.
Sure, that's one of only one direction. That's a big one. And so it'll teach us about our brains, maybe an aspect about our brains that have been bypassed. Is it going to change our whole structure of consciousness? I actually doubt it. It might push it a little bit in one direction or another. Just because these things that we venture into new applications using psi may not change the whole history of everything. There's a phrase in Silicon Valley which I don't like, this will change everything, and it almost never does, except the iPhone did. But it doesn't mean therefore it's not valuable. I mean, some of the smallest things that are extremely important in understanding nature and physics are exquisitely tiny and hard to measure, and they turn out to be very, very important in trying to understand how the world works. Now let's look at it. We have physics, okay, we have a lot of things to say about that. Psychology, maybe there's a real big interface between the psychological counseling and psi, and people have looked at that at some bit. Philosophically, maybe we have a lot to say about the nature of philosophy. Psychophysiology, can the body respond to a future stimulus? And many experiments seem to think that. And we might even address the big question of non-material versus material consciousness and spirituality. And we are developing a toolkit that might help us address some of these things. And frankly, the collection of parapsychologists, including myself today, are not equipped to take that next step properly.
Well, I know you still have some big plans of your own in terms of the research you'd be interested in doing next.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. We've talked a lot in some of the earlier discussions we've had about a model of precognition. And in there is in the neuroscience domain some very exquisitely testable things, none of which am I capable of doing on my own or at all. So I've been lucky to dealing with some neuroscientists, and we have hopefully a hook into getting some rather substantial amount of money to do that. And I can't mention their names right now until we actually get the thing in progress.
But the point here, if I understand you, is that parapsychologists are likely to advance their field and knowledge in general the most by working in interdisciplinary teams with specialists from many other fields and contributing their part.
Yeah, I benefited immensely. At the height of our program, I had $2 million a year with the funding, and I had 12 full-time people with a variety of disciplines. And we made more progress then, like any group that does. Working alone in one lab and somebody else working alone in another lab, that's a very unproductive way to go about it. On the other hand, interdisciplinary research can be very frustrating and very inefficient because on the one hand, you're not constrained by the rules I know to be true in physics, and maybe I'm not constrained by talking to a psychologist by the rules he knows must be, so we can really feed into each other.
Yeah.
But it's very inefficient because, I'm sorry, those rules have never been violated and they're not going to be violated now. Move on.
Yeah.
So it's a complex thing, but worthy of the journey. We really need to go after it.
Well, back to practical applications for a moment.
Yeah.
I know the one thing you seem to be saying is don't get your hopes up too high here.
Yeah.
That in spite of some of the enormous successes I know you've had in Stargate, you have a great appreciation for the many times that the projects failed.
We learn we learn more from the things that fail. In fact, neurophysiology, brain science, has learned most about the things from pathology. And so science learns from its mistakes and its blind alleys, including us.
Still, with regard to practical applications, would you advise, for example, governments to be involved in the future and to initiate new programs for psychic espionage?
That's an interesting question. Yes, well, let's hope they're still doing it. I don't think they are, but I don't know for sure. Yeah, because it's cheap and safe. General Alexei Yorovich Savin ran the Russian remote viewing program for a whole bunch of years, and he had 120 remote viewers. And he takes his remote viewers to the battlefield in Chechnya. So I said, hey, Alexei, what about remote? What don't you understand about remote and remote viewing? You don't have to take them. He says, oh, but it really motivates them. Well, we can argue about whether that's true or not, but they were on the front line. They had to learn weapons, hand-to-hand combat. Elena Klimova had to learn how to drive a nuclear sub. What? Why are they doing that?
Well, do you have information that they got good data that way?
That's a tricky, interesting question. The short answer is no, but there's a but. They may not be willing to share it with me. I do have direct experience with Elena Klimova as one hell of a good remote viewer. I ran a remote viewing trial. One trial doesn't prove anything, but she was really good.
Well, that says something.
Yeah, right.
And I know that you and General Savin wanted to work together jointly to have a U.S. Russian mission using remote viewers to help the counterterrorism effort.
Yes, and what was a big surprise to us is Savin, who was still in the military at the time, said, take all the pictures you want. And by the way, here's my organization chart, all the things we had dreamed about when we were spying on him. He's handing to me, really. And he asked me to write up what's called an intelligence contact report, or he knew that I would. And I handed that to the 3-star admiral in charge of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I said, this guy in Russia wants to go forward. It's inexpensive. It's safe. No one's going to be in harm's way, and critical if it's handled right. He looked at it and said, thank you very much. I walked out the door, and I'm sure it landed in the circular file. Nothing happened.
Well, do you think that was a mistake on his part?
Absolutely a mistake. It's not that, again, it's like any application. We are not going to solve an intelligence problem in and itself, but nor should any collection asset solve an intelligence problem by itself. But we never have an opportunity to integrate what the psychics do with the rest of the intelligence community. Because it was they only gave us the impossible problems to solve, and the fact that we solved a reasonable fraction of them is itself a miracle.
Well, supposing a person who is a government decision maker is able to watch this video right now and says to themselves, gee, too bad that the individual that you pursued back then didn't take the possibility further, but maybe they would like to. Is it still possible for U.S.-Russian cooperation in today's environment?
Absolutely. We're trying to set it up now. We're putting together an email listserv of younger people, including now Savin, who's a little bit between my age and yours, wants to move forward with it. Mm-hmm. We spent a lot of time. I was in Moscow in December, and we spent a lot of time planning what the future might look like, including that. Because in counterterrorism, which is a big problem all over the world, we're not going to solve that per se, but we'll get clues to help other people solve the problem.
Now, I know you have been all over the world traveling and lecturing about the work that you've done. Do you see the possibility for cooperation with other countries?
In the UK, for sure. There's a language barrier. I was invited to join a Russian solid-state physics lab to spend time there to try to build a psychic chip. And that never came about because there was big language problems and money problems and so on. We desperately need some serious funding. And when I mean serious funding, I'm not talking about $50,000 from the BL Foundation. That won't help much. We need something like anywhere between $10 and $20 million to do the job correctly. And in terms of overall big programs, that's cheap.
Yeah.
But it's impossible for most of us parapsychology types.
Well, you certainly have had contracts in that range in the past, so the possibility of that happening in the future isn't unthinkable.
Absolutely not unthinkable. In fact, there are a number of organizations. One I'll mention, if you go online, look at the the James S. Mcdonnell Foundation. They are willing to fund up to $6 to $7 million for some creative research in cognitive science.
So if you had to choose between pursuing for the rest of your career, and I know you're still active, between doing applied work, operational projects versus research, pure research, you lean towards pure research.
Well, not only lean to it, I don't want to do applications for the military anymore. It's a younger person's job.
Okay. I mean, in other words, you think it's worthwhile for the right younger people, but not for you.
Because it's something you can't waltz in and do and then leave. You know, I'm going to waltz in. I'm 76 years old. How much time do I have left? But somebody who's like 30 or 40 can have a whole career doing that, and that's what you need to do it.
But, you know, truly, somebody who's 30 or 40 just getting into the field could benefit greatly from the knowledge and experience you've accumulated over the last 2-3 decades of your work.
Well, Jeffrey,
your career.
You've gone a long way with this 10 interviews we've done. Hopefully someone will be encouraged about it. I hope that somehow when you publish these, you can give them my email address, and if they're interested in talking to them, I'm open to talking.
There will be links to your website.
Oh, good.
And people can find that by going to the listings page that they can get right from the homepage at newthinkingaloud.com for those who might want to go there right now.
You know, I get contacts, letters. Let me reinverse that. I just came from a medical conference in Porto, Portugal on the placebo effect. And a whole bunch of people, mainstream MDs, were really excited, we exchanged cards, blah, blah. I write them a letter, I never hear from them again. Now, I don't know what that's about. Maybe it's about the field or what have you, but they find maybe it's risky. I just don't know. And these are people from all over the world.
Well, there's still a stigma associated, and people are looking at the placebo effect, let us say, from mainstream medicine, and it doesn't occur to them that there might well be a parapsychological component. They may even feel threatened by that.
Well, interesting you say that. Jessica Gotts, professor of statistics, gave an absolutely brilliant talk introducing parapsychology to this group of people and said, all right, I know it's hard to believe, but let's assume that it were true. If it were true, here is its impact to your areas of study. Now, the only exciting thing that happened, I met one of those mainstream guys from Harvard, and he said, okay, you do weirder stuff than we do, and nobody accepts our work. So what? Oh, really?
Yeah.
So I said, what's your problem? He said, well, Big Pharma thinks we're trying to put them out of business with a placebo effect.
Yeah.
And the whole conference demonstrated that that's not the case. And I said, the mistake you guys have is you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's and publishing in mainstream journals, and that does not even address the issue of what your problem is. Your problem is you've got to convince the Big Pharma that you're not putting them out of business, and you need to invite them in and join you. He said, oh, I never thought of that. Mm-hmm. He said, well, what's your problem? I said, our problem is philosophical. People reject what we do from a philosophical basis. That's a much harder thing to overcome. Mm-hmm. Now, Max Planck, one of the co-founders of quantum theory, has a very famous statement, which I think you know. New ideas are adopted in physics not by the force of their arguments, but the old people die, and the young ones come along and have never heard the old idea.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be the case. But now, with regard to the people who think that parapsychology is impossible because of their philosophical belief, mm-hmm. generally these people are philosophical materialists. And anyone listening to our interviews would know that you consider yourself a right. physicalist or a materialist, and yet you don't see the same conflict that they see.
Well, most of the people I talk to, because I am a materialist, they're willing to pay attention to me. Uh-huh. You know, if you're a materialist, mainstream neuroscientist, well, what? You're not posing incense and non-material consciousness. You're putting this all in the physiology range? Oh, maybe I should pay attention.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is that if parapsychologists really want to reach out to the mainstream, they ought to rethink their opposition to materialism.
I think so. At least be open to all possible those points of view. Part of the overall, I gave a paper once about what's wrong with our field, and it was pretty grumpy. Mm-hmm. But the idea is we're terrible salespeople of what we do. You know, if you're trying to convince a room full of neuroscientists, you don't go say, everything you know about neuroscience is wrong and let me educate you. That's not a very good sales technique. Mm-hmm. But I'm afraid collectively we do that, or some variation on that theme.
Well, that is a very good point to end this fascinating interview and fascinating series of interviews with Ed May. This has been a great pleasure. Thank you.
It has for me too, Jeffrey. I really appreciate it, and thank you.
And thank you too for being with us.